So first of all, a warm welcome to everyone who's joining from around the world. And so good day, good evening to everyone. For us, we have this session focusing on building an inclusive, resilient and sustainable cities in relation to COVID-19 recovery in urban areas. And my name is Haoliang Xu. I'm the director of UNDP's policy, Bureau for Policy and Program Support. I'm delighted to join you today to moderate an important discussion on how we can ensure that our efforts help inclusive, resilient, sustainable, and people-centric COVID-19 recovery for urban communities around the world. As we know, cities around the world account for an estimated 90% of the confirmed COVID-19 cases. As a result, they have been at the forefront of mitigating the health and the social economic impacts of the pandemic. So there are just two key facts that I would like to highlight very quickly. Inadequate housing is still a reality for 1.6 billion people globally, with 1 billion people living in informal settlements. And really a huge challenge. We'll talk more about it. And the second thing is that cities represent 80% of the world's GDP and account for more than 70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So it just underscores how critical the roles of the cities are towards the low carbon and green economic recovery that we all want to see. So in our discussions today, we have a really distinguished panel of speakers. And we will explore a few questions with them. And this includes how cities and communities are designing targeted measures to protect the needs of vulnerable population groups. And how we can do something to foster affordable and inclusive housing solutions. And how do we leverage digital technologies while addressing the digital divide? And how can we build the resilience of urban communities to shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic while reimagining urban living through inclusive green recovery and urban development solutions? So with these questions, let me quickly introduce our distinguished speakers. We have with us Mr. Robert Moga, a co-founder of Igarapi Institute, Brazil, and you can find his and other speakers' CV bio on our website, the link to the meeting. And so to save time, I will not go into the details of his achievements. He just mentioned that he was discussing related issues on CNN a few days ago. So I'm very happy that we have him. And also we have Ms. Malaika Cheney-Coker, who is the Director of Research and Thought Leadership at the Terwillig Center for Innovation in Shelter Habitat, Habitat for Humanity International, who is our co-organizer of this event. And we also have Ms. Sarah Kandirachi, Associate Director of International Development Group, ALUP, who we can hear more about the really fascinating work about design, place-making concept that they have been using for reimagining our cities. We also have Ms. Smriti Johari, who is a program leader of the Society for the Promotion of Area Resource Center, India, affiliated with Slum Dwellers International. Really welcome you, Ms. Johari from Mumbai. We have also Dr. Jonathan Recantile, who is a founder on Human Future and author of Smart Cities and for Dummies. And in future, I will introduce him a bit more about his role that he had in city in California state. And we also have then Ted Chen. Ted is a co-founder and CEO and the chief product architect of Evercom Singapore. And good to see you again, Ted. So welcome to our distinguished panelists again. And to everyone online, please note that there's a question answer box that you can use to post your questions or comments. And our UNDP team will be answering your questions in real time, and we will direct questions as well to the speakers. So this session is organized in 2 rounds. Okay, the first round is that I will pose a specific question to our distinguished speakers one by one, and then we come to a second round, with a common question of how do we find the solutions. And so the first session will require speakers to speak about 5-6 minutes, so that we have time to cover all our speakers. And so let me start. Okay, so Robert, welcome again. Okay, so in your recent book, from August 2020, right, which is called Terra Incognita, 100 maps to survive the next 100 years, you mentioned that in a globalized era, we're confronted with a range of interconnected threats, including extreme inequality, infectious disease outbreaks, and the climate crisis. And you emphasize the urgency of engaging with all of them simultaneously, which seems to be really a serious difficulty and a challenge. Okay, so from your perspective, right, your vast experience of advising national and city governments, international organizations, private sector, civil society organizations, right? Based on your experience, how have urban areas prioritized and dealt with these interconnected threats? And what are some of the priorities in helping cities address the health and the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19? Bigger question, okay, so over to you, Robert.
Thanks so much, Hao-Ling. Let me just first say what a delight it is to be here with Habitat and UNDP in this a really impressive panel of pretty astonishing people. So I'm honored to be part of it. And let me also commend whoever's playing that very wonderful piano in the background, which I'm assuming somebody's practicing hard. So let me commend that as well. It's wonderful. It is really a pleasure. And thank you for this question. I mean, maybe I'll start by simply saying what is obvious, which is that cities are on the front line of many, if not all, of our most serious global challenges. And that's, I think, fairly obvious, but sometimes we forget that it's cities that often are bearing the brunt of climate change, of pandemics, of rapid digitalization, of inequality, and all of those sort of challenges that you've already alluded to. And it's the vulnerable in our cities, the poor, the elderly, the infirm, minorities, migrants, who often are the most exposed lived in urban spaces. The good news, and I think we need to start with some good news because we can get gloomy pretty quickly in conversations, is that cities are really innovation, engines of innovation, of experimentation, and of development. And I've said many times before, and I'll say again, that people who live in cities are on balance, not all, but on balance, healthier, wealthier, live longer than those who live in the rural areas. But cities are facing a paradox today. On the one hand, and this is something we detail in the book with Ian Golden, is that cities are facing systemic and interconnected risks, many of which are out of their control. And yet, on the other hand, cities lack the mandate and resources to engage with these issues in a proactive way. And this is because, with the exception of a handful of global cities, most large, medium, and small cities around the world actually have fairly limited power and discretion. They're facing enormous liabilities and deficits, and they're struggling to raise financing. Now, this is starting to change, albeit fairly slowly. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen cities agitating for more influence and decision-making power, including in the halls of the UN in New York, but also, and this is really important, outside of it. We're seeing cities and city coalitions stepping up on the big issues, often leading by example or joining forces across common priorities. And one of the reasons I think cities are finding their voice is because, frankly, cities are growing in size, in number, and economic clout. And you alluded to this, but I think it's worth recalling that in 1950, there were just 3 cities in the world with 10 million people or more. Today, we call these megacities, and today there are over 35. About half a century ago, there were about 80 cities with over 1 million people, compared to today, where there's 550 cities with more than 1 million. And there are some cities with bigger GDPs. In fact, there are hundreds of cities with bigger GDPs than most nation states. You know, New York has a bigger GDP than Russia. Paris's GDP is bigger than Mexico. Sao Paulo has a larger economy than Thailand. So I think the point here is that the pandemic won't and doesn't spell the end of cities, far from it. In fact, I think what we're seeing is the potential for new thinking about everything from urban planning to building design, to energy transition, to the green economy. And there's precedent to this. If you go back in time, historically, disease outbreaks have almost always triggered some kind of design improvement in urban life, notwithstanding the extraordinarily grim impacts on mortality and morbidity. But the bubonic plague in the 14th century resulted in prohibitions on squalid urban spaces. Malaria and cholera outbreaks in the 19th and 20th centuries triggered upgrades to ventilation and sewage. In the 20th century, we had typhoid, polio, flu, which led to reforms in zoning, waste management, and the built environment. And I think the same is true potentially for COVID-19. The reality is that cities and national governments and state governments are facing wrenching revenue shortfalls and are going to be facing more and more austerity. And so I think mayors and city councils around the world know that they're going to have to do more with less. And the good news is, by and large, most people don't want a return to the old normal, that world of long commutes or crammed offices or unaffordable housing or extreme pollution. I think that, you know, as grim as the pandemic is, and we're far from out of it, it's continuing to get worsened in some parts of the world. But as grim as it's been, we could actually see a potential for building back better and building back wiser by potentially designing in resilience. And this isn't some romantic pipe dream. I think it's actually key to our survival. You know, our cities, as you mentioned, are contributing to and experiencing intensifying heat, more frequent and intense disasters, rising seas, worsening pollution, increasing exposure to real and digital viruses. We literally can't afford to go back to the old normal. So I think the pandemic is creating an opportunity for some enlightened leaders and social entrepreneurs to think about really redesigning aspects of city systems. And we're seeing this starting to happen, you know, and we're seeing it in places like Amsterdam, we're seeing it in Medellin, we're seeing it in Melbourne, we're seeing it in Freetown. We're seeing city leaders that are looking to build healthier, greener, more digital and regenerative design, more micromobility, more renewable energy, more inclusive public spaces. Ideas like the 15-minute city or the 20-minute neighborhood and circular economics are starting to go mainstream. And I think that the shift that we've seen during the pandemic that was, you know, accelerated that trend of digitalization towards more e-services and e-commerce and digital connectivity is really redefining what resilience means in the 21st century. So if COVID has taught us anything, it's that we're living through a dress rehearsal for the most urgent crisis of all, which is climate change. So to conclude, the way I think cities are taking action, so to get right to the nub of your question, I think is by banding together into global, regional, and national coalitions and networks. They're not only sharing ideas and lobbying and applying pressure, but cities are also taking collective action independently on their own, getting ahead of nation states. Right now, there are more than 300 global city networks taking action across a range of global common goods challenges. Over 10,500 cities have signed up to a covenant of mayors to achieve more ambitious renewable energy commitments. Hundreds more are setting up coalitions to deliver on everything from welcoming migrants to halving violence. And I think the smartest cities understand that they can't just be digitally connected and deliver efficient services, although they have to do that. They also have to get carbon neutral. They've got to deploy nature-based solutions. They've got to be minority and migrant friendly. They have to be more inclusive and economically productive. I think these attributes are not just key to thriving, but to surviving the future. So I'll hand back to you.
Great, really, Robert, you spoke so eloquently about both the challenges and also give hope, you know, to what, you know, could become, you know, with COVID as you said, the greatest rehearsal, you know, towards the future we want to see. So I think it's really, you know, a positive framing of the discussion. So thank you very much. Apologies for the background, you know, music you mentioned, and sorry about my son's practicing, you know, and this part of urban living that is tight schedule, you know, and we can talk offline. Apologies, but really thank you very much for this wonderful framing. Okay, so let me move on to our next distinguished speaker, our co-organizer from Humanity for, you know, Habitat for Humanity, you know, Malaika, you know, for over 40 years, right? And we know that Habitat, for Humanity have helped build not just the houses, right, but the homes, for families around the world. And but drawing on your recent research, cornerstone of recovery, how housing can help emerging market economies recover from COVID-19. Right? So why is it important for urban areas to address the housing sector within their COVID-19 recovery plans, right? And this sounds intuitive, but why such a question still needs such an attention, okay? Particularly, what is the broader role of housing in alleviating urban poverty and inequality, building the resilience of vulnerable population groups, and spearheading a green recovery? Over to you, Malaika.
Sorry, thank you, Zhao-Liang, and let me first also express my thanks and the privilege that it is to be here with this esteemed panel and with you and with our audience. And please, no need to apologize for the lovely piano music in the background. It's actually a great soundtrack to this event. So over to your question, and to first address the obvious, housing is inextricably linked to urban development. It might seem obvious again, but we know that there is, of course, a pretty intense urbanization challenge. At the same time, there is a global housing crisis, and these two things are very much linked. They've been linked before COVID, and they continue to be linked during COVID and afterwards. So if we address the one, we have to address the others. It's actually impossible to address urban development and urban recovery from COVID without looking at housing. Unlike Robert starting with some good news, I'm actually going to start with some bad news, unfortunately, which is that SDG 11's target number 1, so target 11.1, which is about essentially by 2030, ensuring that everyone has access to safe, adequate, affordable housing and basic services, and that informal settlements are upgraded. That is only one of 5 SDG targets that is regressing, and out of 35 for which we have data. And so that is alarming. It's not as though there hasn't been progress made on housing, it's just that the rapid urbanization in so many cities is counteracting some of that progress, and progress really does need to be much more decisive. So that's important not only for solving housing challenges in cities, but because housing really has outsized effects on other SDGs. In fact, housing has direct or indirect impacts on 13 out of 17 SDGs. So as cities look to recover from the pandemic and they look to simultaneously address all these aspects of human development, they really can't do so without strategically and very deliberately and decisively addressing housing. The COVID recovery context also does present some unique opportunities for working decisively and deliberately in the housing sector. And as far as the report that you referenced, one thing that we looked at was housing's share of the economy with the intent of making the argument that as countries and cities look to mitigate the economic fallout from COVID, that they think to the housing sector and ways in which they could link housing policy with economic policy. So we found out, for example, that housing, the sector was on average 14 to 16% of GDP across the 11 emerging market economies we looked at, which is substantial. And we have another study upcoming looking at housing's share of the labor market, and it's also quite large. It's actually the largest employer behind the agricultural sector. So alluding to what Robert was saying about cities having this, they're really in a tough spot of having to address these multiple crises and do more with less at the same time that they're really, their revenues are decimated, their expenditure has been so high. Housing really is one of those areas by which you can accomplish these multiple objectives, the development objectives, economic revival. And I will address one more, which is the environmental component. So again, some eye-popping stats. the construction sector and energy use in buildings combined represent about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's massive. About 40% of the waste in landfills is from construction and demolition. So there's no way in which cities can effectively reach a green, inclusive economic recovery without, for the green part especially, thinking about how to do so, how to make housing more green, how to make the construction sector more green. And then specifically to some of the areas that you mentioned around, how housing can address poverty and resilience and address inequality, all really critical areas. When you think about it, the house is the family's largest asset. If you flip that, the house is also, for many families, most in some cases, the family's largest expenditure, especially in very heavy rental markets. And so there's really no way for families to acquire generational wealth or overcome poverty if housing continues to be this inordinate expense for them. And there's just other very commonsensical ways. For example, the ability for children to be able to study well, child health, all these things very much impacted by the quality of the house. So for all these reasons, housing is hugely important for inequality and overcoming poverty in urban areas.
No, thank you. Malaika, I think you, as you started, you indicated how important housing is. The 11.1, goal is to 13 other, SDGs. I think you again closed by making that linkage again. So it's very clear that housing is critical for leaving no one behind agenda. For really addressing so many other, goals for the SDGs. And this reminds me of the question of energy. For example, energy is also fundamental, for achieving a lot of SDGs, not just 17, or not just goal 7, for the energy. And so I think, so thank you very much for again laying out, the critical importance of housing and how, the national governments can address this, through the policies that they conduct. So thank you very much. Let me move to Sarah. Okay. So Sarah, ARUP, is internationally known for for bringing together architects, designers, and engineers that truly understand the complexities of international development, such as their work on inclusive and resilient cities and on child-centered design and planning, right? So drawing on the work of ARUP, how has the placemaking, right, this idea, placemaking, interesting word, and the design of public spaces increased the livability and in a holistic well-being of urban residents, even during the COVID-19 pandemic, and certainly beyond. Over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank UNDP and Abda for Humanity for inviting me to this important webinar. And thanks also to Malaika and Robert for setting up the scene so well in a very comprehensive way. So starting also with an obvious statement, we all know very well that across the world, the coronavirus pandemic has caught city systems off guard, and we are all familiar with the consequences, which have been devastating. But at the same time, I think the pandemic has also created an opportunity to consider a new urban future. So at ARUP, over the past year and so, we've been commissioned a survey considering different cities, particularly in Europe, particularly Berlin, London, Madrid, Milan, Paris, basically to understand how people living in major cities have been impacted by the virus. At the same time, we also examine how city authorities, city makers, and people have, in response to the virus, have addressed the many challenges that they were faced with, and what the implication of their decisions and behavior are for city design and planning. So the research we conducted shows that the pandemic gave people the chance to better envision a more sustainable urban future, and is giving us as urban practitioners and decision makers also the opportunity to change our approach to city planning. And the research also shows that city dwellers now want cleaner and less traffic-filled cities. And they also want to spend more time with loved ones, with families, with friends. And also we saw that with the pandemic, as it was pointed out by Robert, urban planning and design have become a vehicle for not only tackling the virus, but also for reshaping the built environment to ensure access to urban services, to amenities, while at the same time securing safety and health for city dwellers. And also we saw many cities jump at the opportunity to redefine the urban realm and to make it more people-centered and sustainable. In particular, we saw that the pandemic has brought us closer to the vision of the 15-minute or 20-minute city, showing the importance of developing cities in smaller modules, which with essential services which are concentrated around the community hubs, around the community needs. So we basically identify 5 key priorities or strategies that city authorities, urban practitioners, city makers should prioritize for creating a more human-centered, more nature-based city, and to create urban spaces that are more inclusive and livable for everyone, in particular for the most vulnerable groups. So the first priority is about walkability, so focus on walkability. We also conduct another research, it's called Towards a Walking World, and we identify 50 key benefits or more to have a more walkable city, including economic, environmental, political, and social benefits. In fact, what we saw is that a walkable neighborhood, it encourages active lifestyle and social cohesion, also enhance the value of local goods and services, is a more accessible neighborhood, creates more accessible cities. In fact, we saw in Bogota, for instance, during the lockdown, the city used that period to expand its ciclovia initiatives, meaning that selected streets that were car-free on Sundays have become car-free all week, basically creating in no time 600 kilometers more or less of new public space. And that model has been followed by other cities like New York and Milan. Another priority that we identify is about rewilding the cities, basically bringing nature back to our cities. And we all know that conversation around greening the city has emerged long time before the pandemic, but it has gained a great momentum at the moment, as both the nature and purpose of public space have been called into question. And what we saw is that we know that urban green spaces have been are particularly important because they can create benefit for both the elderly and the young population, for the entire society, of course, but in particular for them. In fact, a connection with the natural world is associated with a great range of physical and mental health benefits, including low rates of obesity, depression, stress, and attention disorders. And also, we all know that nature-based solutions have been shown to be critical for both climate change, adaptation, and mitigation measures. A third key priority is about play, so creating public space for play. We've been doing quite a lot of work on child-friendly cities, and as I also before the pandemic, but we saw that children and youth have been among the most vulnerable and affected groups by COVID-19 restriction measures. In fact, their needs have been overlooked by most government authorities when planning for a pandemic response or recovery. And the virus has dismantled children and youth ecosystem for play, social interactions, and learning. So we need to maximize opportunity for play in cities, knowing also that child-friendly city approach generate multiple benefits for everyone. So as ARO, we started our partnership before the pandemic with the Real Play Coalition, which is a group of play advocates, including IKEA, National Geographic, Life Foundation, UNICEF, and ARO, of course. And we developed an urban play framework to understand the complexity of play in cities and how the urban environment can create play opportunities for children, working already in London, Cape Town, and now we're working in Milan. Another key priority is to create multifunctional and multi-generational spaces, because we know that across the world, the demand for high quality multifunctional space is becoming a necessity, not just a luxury. In densely packed cities, in informal settlements, we need to look to reuse existing or outdated infrastructure, such as, I don't know, car parks, school grounds, community hubs, for creating neighborhood activities targeting different social groups. Like for instance, we can use schools for dance studios after hours, or for training facilities for working adults. Or we can use public square can become open air cinemas, or street can become spaces for dining or socializing. And the last priority that we identify is the need to a citywide digital transformation. Because before COVID, digital transformation was largely a priority within individual sectors, but the pandemic has proven that there is a need for real-time geolocated publicly available information to city managers across all sectors. So we should no longer consider digitalization of health, sanitation, transport, supply chains, and even labor practice in isolation. So digital strategies must embrace the provision of all public services in an interconnected way. And to conclude, I think that for all of us, COVID-19 has been a huge challenge. It still is in many cases, but I think has been an eye-opening, showing that by adopting collective measures, change is possible and can be fast. And I hope that city authorities, city makers will use this crisis as an opportunity to implement lots of widespread interventions at different scales, bringing, I don't know, green spaces to great places, or prioritizing cycling and walking, and making public spaces work for the most vulnerable groups, in particular for children, elderly people, or people with disabilities. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, for mentioning all these really interesting ideas that are, I guess, important and central to a healthy lifestyle, right? And I think for healthy urban living. And it's great that you have, really built a lot of, expertise around these areas, and you speak with examples from various parts of the world, about, these lessons learned, so I think this can really be very useful, for other cities, definitely. So thank you very much for sharing these insights. And now I think in a way it's really very good for me to move to our next distinguished speakers. That is Smruti. So really, Smruti, your the background, your the Zoom background, really is I don't know how to say that, with a stark reminder, of the challenges we're facing in achieving the SDGs in urban, areas, so it's just really a very, strong impression that the picture is making, on me, and I'm sure on our listeners and participants. So let me just ask you, okay, you have worked extensively across cities in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa to design inclusive urban planning solutions for the urban poor and vulnerable communities, and working closely with the Slum Dwellers International, particularly in informal settlements. Right? So you, in your inspirational TED Talk on what if poor were part of our city planning, you highlighted several examples of empowering the urban poor to design their solutions. Okay, so what are some of the biggest challenges that residents of informal settlements are being confronted with during the COVID-19 pandemic? What are some of the local stories of resilience that demonstrate how residents of informal settlements have adapted to these challenges? Can you give us your insights, please, Smruti?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting Grassroots to this event today, and it really means a lot to us. This is a great opportunity, and this is an amazing discussion, and glad to be a part of it. I think the most fundamental non-empowering variable is whether a slum is recognized, or slums are recognized by cities to provide basic amenities, and whether these amenities are adequate in the conversation we are having today. So COVID has clearly shown that there is inadequacies in amenities that are being given to slum dwellers. Now, the challenges with respect to access to basic services, shelter, water, sanitation, healthcare, we can go on, have always remained the same before COVID and during COVID. It's only that during COVID they have surfaced, these inadequacies have just surfaced. So I'd like to emphasize more on the three most critical challenges. So one being shelter. We've been listening quite often about being home is the most basic necessity during COVID. And work from home, live at home, be safe at home is what we've been hearing. But the reality is that the networks in our federation, especially in Africa, have seen that thousands of people were evicted during the pandemic. So it's really questioning the right to shelter. The other challenge that we've seen, communities have talked about is about the availability of rental markets. So most rental markets, as we know in the global south today, is in slums. So what happens when shelter? There's absolutely no social rental market available in cities that Robert was talking about, and more and more cities are getting denser, and there is no alternate housing markets for slum dwellers. Now, the design also of pro-poor housing that's coming up, and it's a model that's been picking up very quickly, not only in India, but many other countries, is of these vertical housing, high density housing. What happens is that in more higher densities, we just cramping people up with very inadequate light and ventilation, making it even more cumbersome during situations like pandemic. And there's absolutely no public spaces or open spaces where people can go out. We've seen in many instances that people, when go out in order to get either a little bit more air from the suffocated 10 by 10 houses, they've been brutally beaten up by the police in many cities because they were strictly supposed to be restricted to be at home. So these are some of the real challenges of shelter when it comes to during the COVID times. Access to water and toilet has always been there. There have been several studies and several dialogues and arguments that have gone back and forth. But we see that in very high density settlements in metro cities where there's absolutely no possibility to have individual toilets, community toilets and community water points are the only places where people can congregate to access these services. Now, what happens in times of pandemic? Are these settlements ready? Are these services adequate? And where do people go to protect themselves from following social distancing when they have to actually go into these toilets, and where there are 20 seats that are available for about 500 people? So these are like real challenges around some of these access to services. The other thing that really went short was access to transport, especially informal transport and formal transport. Public transport was suddenly curbed, and people were cut off from work, and their ability to go get money in cases or aid in case when there was sudden lockdown was something that seriously affected communities. So in the beginning, it was very terrible, but most help that came from aid agencies, institutions, governments, international agencies just came later. But during the buffer period, it was the biggest help that came was through residents, through our organized communities and networks and grassroots. So I think it's the ability of organizations and the ability of local communities to congregate and work together in order to make representations, both locally with the governments and political representatives, to seek support is what really worked during the pandemic. And that is something that has always resonated with the Federation's work, and it has been demonstrated across 33 countries where they've worked, that be it a pandemic or a non-pandemic situation, this is the only way that has helped people to get or to negotiate with the city with what they want. So in terms of planning, I think Robert mentioned very well in the beginning that planning has always is also just like cholera or bubonic plague. It's cholera that gave this rise to this discipline of urban planning, where sewage systems were more technically equipped, or let's say the science of putting in better sewage systems came in place. So I think this situation in COVID has only given more, I would say it surfaced what problems were already persistent. I don't think that there are newer problems. I think it just means for cities to be more equipped. It means that cities need to recognize that there were things in the past that were hidden under the carpet and that it cannot go on any more longer like this. That settlements and vulnerable informal settlements need to be prioritized, and these inadequacies need to be dealt with ASAP. And there is no way that we can plan for future without catering to some of these challenges.
No, thank you very much, Smruti. I think brought us down to really what is essential, for the informal settlements, residents in these informal settlements is really the basic requirements, for their well-being of different kinds. I think what this says to me is that it's just this challenge, solutions to this are really linked to so many other issues that we are trying to deal with, such as governance, right? The accountable and inclusive governance, the responsive, government to the needs of people and whatever their background, and so I think really it's not just about generic urban solutions, or solutions to urban challenges. It really goes back to the fundamental rights of people to development, and also accountable and responsive, inclusive governance systems that can make changes. As you said, it cannot be delayed any further. Right? So I think really, thank you for highlighting these basic points that are really key, for us to remember. And as the UNDP is developing a new strategic plan for the next 4 years, I think the discussion today and your points, Smriti, really is reminding us, what we're there to do to achieve. That ultimately is a focus on people. That's why today's workshop, has the word people-centric, in urban recovery in its title. So thank you very much, and the discussion definitely is going to be continued. Thank you. And let me move on to our next speaker, who is Jonathan, right? Who is a former chief information officer of the city of Palo Alto in the state of California, in the United States. So Jonathan, you have been at the forefront of digital innovation in building smart cities. Okay, and in your recent book, from smart cities to for dummies. Actually, I was wondering, if you have the, permission to use the word for dummies, because I tried to do a report in this name. I was told I couldn't do it. Okay, but anyway, in your report, okay, Smart City for Dummies, you highlighted that new ideas powered by technology are positively changing how we move humans and the products from one place to another. You cited many examples, from energy, from waste, to dealing with climate crisis and so forth. Okay, so with the COVID-19 pandemic, has also pointed, towards large gaps in the ability to access digital technologies, particularly among vulnerable population groups. Okay, and this has exacerbated inequalities in the availability of online education, vaccine registration, and many other critical services. So from your experience, how can smart cities implement digital technologies to guarantee inclusion and bridge the digital divide? Over to you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much, Halong, and thanks for the privilege of being part of this. I really appreciate Renata and the UNDP for inviting me today. It's just a thrill to be here, and I'm really enjoying the insights that our colleagues here are providing, so rich and deep. So much appreciated, certainly from my perspective. I hope the participants are all also getting a lot of value from it. Look, we've gone through this, and we're going through this incredible tragedy of COVID and this pandemic. But I think we'd all agree, for those of us who have access to the internet, thank goodness we have the internet. Can you imagine a few decades ago that going through this and not having connectivity the way we have it today? We couldn't do this. We couldn't do a Zoom call like this and have people join us from all over the world. In many countries in the world, people couldn't work. I mean, it would have been so devastating. So not only should we be grateful, which I am certainly, for the availability of the internet, but I think what has happened is, while some of us recognized that there were challenges with the availability of internet, COVID has really elevated that to be a top priority. Humans need access to the internet, and they have to be connected. So this becomes a core learning and a core aspect of the future. We have to build in our cities and beyond, throughout our rural world too, a digital infrastructure to connect people. And you listed in the question, for example, when people are not connected, this creates a massive digital divide, right? People can't attend school. They can't get access to timely information. It impacts decision-making and the richness of participation. So let's look at where we're at and what we need to do about this, because I think this is a key takeaway from this period of time. And I hope largely perhaps a good news story as an emergence from COVID. So today, you know, we're 18 months away from the planet reaching 8 billion people. So we're going to get to 8 billion in 2023. And the question is, how many people on the planet have access to the internet? Well, we think it's about 4.6 billion currently. That's about 59%, almost 60% of human beings have some access to the internet. By the way, mostly mobile, it turns out, about 92% is mobile. So I often ask this question, you know, to my students: do they think this is a good news story or bad news story? It depends, you know, if you think the glass is half full or half empty. You could say it's amazing that we've connected 60% of the world, but you could say it's terribly disappointing that 3.5 billion who woke up this morning still don't have access. So the question then is, how do we get those next 2 and 3 billion people online? It's happening at a reasonable rate, but probably not fast enough. I think we could agree to that. I wanted to use 2 examples in my little talk today, a tale of 2 cities, if you like. And I'll take New York City, right? New York City, one of the great cities of the world, a mega city, right? Has about, depending how you measure it, you know, its boundaries, about 20 million people. And it might surprise people from around the world that 2 in 5 New Yorkers are what we call underconnected. That means they either don't have a connection or the connection is really bad. That's in New York City. What I think we could all argue is one of the most advanced and progressive cities in the world. So what are they doing about it? Well, the first thing you got to do, you got to have a plan, right? You got to have a significant plan, and that plan requires leadership. So the mayor of New York City is all in, and they've decided that we are going to solve this problem once and for all. Now, it won't be done overnight. You know, it's going to take a decade or more to connect those underconnected. And how are they doing it? Well, one of the major drivers of this change is to create more competition, because competition will drive lower costs, make it more affordable for a lot of people, you know, encourage more innovation. The city is making available, for example, the tens of thousands of city properties that they own for infrastructure. So a telco company can come in and put wiring and other technologies in place where they couldn't before, because that's often very, very, very difficult. Now, saying sort of that New York is going to pursue the internet for all its people is one thing. And then the question is, well, what are the results? Well, the results we think are going to be pretty spectacular. For example, by the late 2030s, connecting more people will result in about $142 billion of additional gross city product. And that also will include 49 billion of personal income increases. But very important for economics is that just by connecting those people, the city will create over 160,000 new jobs. So this requires real effort, real investment, real money, and a journey to get there. The other city I want to talk about is Lagos in Nigeria, also a megacity. And again, depending how you measure it, they also have somewhere between 14 and 20 million people. And internet access is quite poor there. About 40% of the city of Lagos has access, growing quickly. Tens of thousands of people are joining every month. but not fast enough, and the infrastructure to connect people isn't extended sufficiently. So again, the government, and this is where a key takeaway is, you got to have leadership, you got to have a commitment, are saying we are now going to solve this. If Lagos and Nigeria are going to have the important role that we expect them to play in the world in terms of participation and competitiveness and good education, they're going to have to get internet to everybody. And so what they've done, they've committed to a shared fiber infrastructure. So the government is putting a lot of investment in to have this undergrounded fiber go to every part of the city, and then that'll be made available at a shared resource to other telcos in the city. Again, they'll want to push competitiveness. That's really key to push price down and to encourage more innovation. There's more to say in this topic, but I think that's the key takeaway that I wanted to leave is we have to put a priority and move forward with a strong digital infrastructure in our cities.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for giving us really concrete examples based on your experience and your clearly strong research into this topic. So thank you very much, and it's encouraging that there are solutions. Right? There are solutions, but I think you also point out that technology and access alone is probably not enough. You need something else. You need a capacity. You need a learning. You need a government policy. The whole ecosystem needs to work for it. So I think so it's really great that you brought these points out. So thank you. So the last round, the last person in this round, is Ted. Okay. Ted, thank you very much for staying up, for so late. I think it's 2 o'clock in Singapore. So thank you very much for your commitment, to working with us, on this really important topic. And in the next round, I will go the reverse order. Okay? I will give you the floor first. If you choose to leave early, please go. But so the next round is a question. Now I shorten this to 2-3 minutes for each person on solutions. But let me just first focus on this round first. Okay. So thank you. Now, Ted, as one of the Asia's 30 under 30. Okay. And you have been working closely with your government and the communities in Singapore, as well as with big business, to leverage technologies to advance communities' well-being along the city's growth and competitiveness, right? So can you share insights in Uganda as a youth tech entrepreneur, engaging with governments, big business, and international organizations, and how we can fully leverage youth, as partners, as more countries and cities committed to achieve our climate goals, as we help recover in cities, right, and build a city, build an urban future that is inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. So can you share your insights, please?
Yes, thank you for having me, and I really miss New York. Usually about this time, I will be right there with you guys during this period. So yeah, with the question, I think in general, young people can be very resourceful, but it's really about how we can work with them to bring that out. So, and I have prepared some example to share, but just a very simple idea is that young people in general, they, especially in the current youth that are growing up in the digital era, being the digital natives, they work slightly differently. And in general, if we give them the right resources, they can get things done much faster and cheaper, and could possibly be doing cheaper, better, and even it could be even faster, cheaper, and better. But the key thing here is really how to guide them. So one of the example is during the early phases of COVID, like the first year of COVID, when we were in Southeast Asia, one of the challenges that many government faces in this area, and many youth organizations also, including when we work with the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, is that we don't know what's going on the ground, right? This was in the first few months of COVID when things become very serious, and then the news and all these is not really quite catch up to what happened on the ground yet. So what we have done that time, leveraging on the youth network, we have university working with them, we have governments, and we have also youth organization in the Southeast Asia. what we have done is we simply just do, nowadays Zoom meeting becomes very normal. But back then, within the first few months, we literally just started Zoom meetings. And for that time, only the young people were very familiar with these kind of setups and structure. So we tap into these kind of Zoom meetings, getting all the youth from different organizations into the chat with different government agencies as well as different organizations. And the whole idea is we start to ask these young people who are based in their cities or their communities, what's exactly happening on the ground, right? So in a way, we're trying to source for firsthand information from the grassroots. And that itself really help us better prioritize, what to do moving forward when the whole COVID situation unfolds. And one of the things that Singapore has done in our collaboration with the Singapore government is we realized that because of all the lockdowns and all the flights and international travels becomes not possible, one of the biggest impact in Singapore and in many countries as well is really the human labor, right? Unfortunately, many of the cities relies on foreign laborers to keep the operation going. You can imagine the moment COVID hit, doesn't matter you're from emerging countries or developed countries, a lot of the daily operations for a lot of the small and medium-sized businesses simply just stop working. So one thing that what we have done is, because we can source these information from youth very quickly, and a lot of the time the youth really knows their communities better than anyone else, because this is where they live in and they have the passion to do something about it for their communities. What we're able to do, at least in Singapore and in Thailand and in Malaysia and so on, is that we started to use digital tools to get data from different small and medium-sized businesses and knowing what's happening on the ground. And with those information digitized, then we start to leverage on the youth network to start to use these digital information from different organizations and start sourcing for help, across different areas. It's almost like going from a multiple to multiple approach for looking for help. And this is really to deal with the supply chain issues during COVID, dealing with the resource allocation issues during COVID. So these are the examples how youth can really help leverage on their digital tools and digital capabilities and their ability to mobilize other young people to help them to spread these information. So this is really one example of how we can leverage on youth in general. And there's also, you mentioned about the young tech entrepreneurs. I think young tech entrepreneurs, when it comes to tackling city issues, especially if it's their communities, there's really much things we can leverage from them. So one thing about those people that are categorized as young tech entrepreneurs, once they can understand the problem clearly, they can really mobilize not just people, but capital very effectively. Especially you look at now, a lot of the international organizations, banks, governments are pouring a lot of green capitals into cities, into projects. And the key enabling points for them to make sure that these money can be used effectively is really, they really depend on technology to help them validate, to help them scale and so on. So even during COVID period, many of these entrepreneurs tackling sustainability related issues are still be able to fundraise and continue to put these new raised investments into their communities through either hiring other peoples or through new projects that can help reduce carbon emission and so on. So I think these are the key 2 points where we can really look at these young people and then trying to figure out either how we can get them better engaged with different organizations or with government agencies to help them tap into these problems, especially if it's their community. And number 2 is how can we attract more tech entrepreneurs to want to put their efforts into sustainability related issues or SDG related issues, right? Because with their ability to fundraise and with their ability to bring in resources, it can really help solve some of these issues in a much cheaper way compared to your traditional or status quo approach. So thank you. That would be my comment.
Thank you very much, Ted. For these insights. I mean, I definitely, I think, we consider youth entrepreneurship, one of the major solutions to many challenges, not only in urban cities, but really as opportunities for young people because of their incredible creativity, and also their willingness to take risks. And so I think if we have a conducive policy environment and the ecosystem to support them, and with young tech leaders like you to also provide hand holding, I think based on your own experience, I think we can really do quite a lot in this COVID post-COVID recovery period. And I know that UNDP in Asia Pacific has major programs to promote youth entrepreneurship, and we have similar programs in Africa and in I think Arab states regions. So we definitely can focus more on this, to really use COVID recovery as an opportunity to push even further in this direction. So thank you very much for your insights. So let me now really turn, so thank you again for all our speakers for your insights. I think it has been really great discussion. And so let me now, we have about 25 minutes for our second round, and I would like now to go reverse order, okay, to pose the same question, right? The same question to all our speakers, maybe you can spend 2-3 minutes, to really get, your key points across. That is, okay, in your expert view, okay, what are the top priority actions, for COVID-19 recovery in urban areas that, can promote inclusive, resilient, sustainable cities and communities? Right? So what are the top actions that you think we should undertake? Right? And again, related, okay, how do we balance the needs of the present and the needs of the future? So with this question, over to you, Ted, again.
Yeah, I think with COVID, again, we have one example to share specifically in Singapore is that it's not enough just to solve a problem, but now we have to actively look into how to solve the problem, but with a much more inclusive approach. So again, I can use COVID as an example. When after COVID, more or less, at least the first phase contained in Singapore, what we were working with the governments and the agencies is that we're looking at the problems about how can we reopen the economy, right? Because again, you cannot lock down and forever. So what is a safer way to open up for the economy, for people to start going to shop and for people to start going out, enjoying all these activities and so on. So one of the ways that we have came about by having a collaboration between government agencies, social enterprise, and also private enterprises. The first thing that we look into is you need to be able to have an effective way and cheap and cost-effective way to track temperature, obviously, because of fevers and all these stuff. So what the government has done is that one of the government agencies in Singapore called GovTech is under the Prime Minister's office. They have made their own software, open source, on computer visions for free for a few of the social enterprises in Singapore. What that means is that they have developed a AI algorithm that by just using normal camera, you can quickly detect the different thermal temperature across a large crowd. So they give that piece of technology free for the social enterprise. And what the social enterprise take that piece of technology is that with that software, then they can start to procure very cheap off-the-shelf cameras and etc. and enables get a lot of the special needs children as well as low-income communities to come in and package all these solutions together, right? And so that in a way, even during a COVID period, you're generating jobs for these people that needed help the most. And once they have these system quickly assembled, then of course we start to distribute and procure them and sell them to the different shops and etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ted. Okay, the essence I'm getting is that really, you needed to take an inclusive approach, okay, and you needed to use tech, but to really take an inclusive approach, and you can really get a lot of benefits out of existing technology if you just change your approach a little bit, be more open, and to other participants in finding solutions. So that's what I'm trying to get, at least really one very concrete point and excellent example. So Jonathan, over to you. What are the top action points that we need to take?
Yeah, thanks for this important question. I think what we've learned very much so from this pandemic is the need for more focus on overall resilience. You know, when you look back at a couple of the major disasters over the last decade, very often after they've happened, we realize that, you know, we should have been thinking about it. We had a lack of imagination, perhaps, that certain people were talking about it, but not everybody was talking about it. And certainly we weren't actioning it enough. So one of the big suggestions that I'm bringing to many city governments around the world is now is the time, if you don't have one, to build out your resilience strategy. And I'm talking about things like cybersecurity, you know, planning for the possibility of another pandemic, for your earthquakes, your natural disasters, and not only to plan, but practice. You've got to practice. Now, the one area where I just want to go a little bit deeper for just a moment, and then I'll conclude, is the cybersecurity, because this has been my theme today, is, you know, we can see all the benefits of digital infrastructure and digital inclusion. There's no question of that, I don't believe. Or there's no question that we all see the advantages of digital inclusion. The question, though, now is we built this sort of global fragile infrastructure that can be a target for those that want to do harm or can just be unavailable. So an investment needs to be made in cybersecurity. We've had a couple of big examples here in the US, the city of Baltimore and the city of Atlanta, where when they were attacked, city services were not available sometimes for days, and in fact, even a few weeks. Cybersecurity work is a little bit like insurance. You know, we don't see much about it if nothing happens, but when something happens, you're happy that you have it, right? So I'm encouraging cities to now super focus on resilience and make sure cybersecurity is part of that.
Great, thank you very much, John. It's very clear. Smruti, over to you.
Yep, I think it's time that we cities acknowledge, very rightly mentioned by Jonathan, that it requires a great amount of political will in order for cities to even begin gathering information about informal settlements. Most cities in the world do not have adequate data on informal settlements. And you would agree that resilience is not something that just comes from one side. It is co-production, and it requires working together with residents in order to produce and demonstrate what to do during a pandemic as such. So I think without disaggregated data at the local level, local governments absolutely have nothing to work on. And it is time that governments acknowledge that data that's being produced at the local level and the deficits that come, to the foreground collected by slum dwellers be acknowledged, and that they work together in order to produce what is relevant in today's context. Because I think it's also time that we realize that we don't have to wait for another pandemic in future to tell us about what we should have done in the past. So I would like to conclude on that note.
No, thank you very much for this really important point. We've learned in this pandemic that for governments in developing countries which have invested prior to the crisis, in digital infrastructure, and they could activate and scale that up very quickly to expand the provision of social services and expanding their social protection networks very, very quickly if they had this investment before. That means if you're counted, you exist and the service is accessible to you. If you're not counted in statistics, then you don't exist, and that's a problem. So I think a digital identity, and as you said, really just the basic, disaggregated data, about informal settlements, about residents, their needs and their challenges and so forth, is an issue that really needs to receive more attention. So I will look forward to working with you on these kind of issues. So thank you very much for highlighting this basic point. Thank you. And let's move on to our next speaker. This time is Sarah, please.
Yeah, thanks. So not an easy question indeed. So I think as city maker, urban planner, I think I feel like it's our responsibility to ensure that cities can meet, can withstand, and also can survive the many different futures they could basically face, while at the same time being able to address and balance the present needs through quick and agile solution, as we saw during the pandemic, the capacity to bounce back quickly to the different challenges in a also creative way. So in addition, I think to the 5 strategies or priority areas that I outlined before on how to make cities and communities more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. So walkable cities or bike-friendly cities, greener cities, public spaces that are more playful and nurturing, that looks at the needs of children, the elderly people more excluded from society or marginalized, and also the need to create multifunctional, multi-generational, more inclusive than spaces, and also the need to look at a citywide digital transformation that is integrated but still human-centered. I like also to share 4 main kind of conclusions or learning from the COVID-19 experience in relation to urban resilience. First of all, I think there is a multi-hazard problem because pandemics have many dimensions, and they generate issues that suddenly connect and form larger problems, and we were just not ready for that. And because we normally have like a traditional single hazard focus, whether we look at flooding, earthquakes, typhoons, bushfires, we are not prepared. This approach, single hazard approach, does not prepare us for tackling crises like pandemic, like COVID. So a resilient city strategy must understand and explore the connections between multiple and cascading hazards. It means moving away from individual departments' responses at collaborative and integrated efforts by professionals, the community, the private sector at large. So a truly resilient strategy, that create more inclusive cities, needs to understand how the multi-other scenarios will unfold. The second learning is about resilience must be proactive, not just reactive. Because the unpredictable nature of urban crises often drives the emergency service to react rather than respond in a more considered way. So a city's emergency response, as we know, is often a system for a city emergency is designed around rescue work in the event of a crisis before focusing on post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. So this just doesn't work for crises like we are going through now. So a proactive approach to urban resilience starts from a deep understanding of a city's systems and operations, because we know cities are complex human beasts, machines, webs of services, needs, livelihood, and behaviors. And so the interconnections and dependencies of cities' many systems mean that coordination is essential to achieving effective resilience. Then there is a need also to decentralize the services to build immunity to crises, because as we saw, many of the public services which are essential to a city's life are managed centrally by a single organization in many cases, and the surge in demand for those services caused by COVID-19 has shown us how painful, vulnerable such centralized organizations are at time of crisis. So the centralization of public service such as waste collection, healthcare, have proven effective in delivering operational and efficiency. And the last learning is that we need to have a user-centered approach in city design and planning, in developing strategy and policies. We need to make sure that the needs, the challenges, the ideas, the dreams from the society are heard and taken into due account, consider the life cycle of project from the beginning up to the end, considering the policy approach, and we need to include the most vulnerable groups, because in this way we can shape solutions that are relevant for the final users of the services. And so just to conclude, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic and its implication for the cities around the world is simply too great an opportunity to reflect upon how we can design and plan urban settlements, and also how we can set up a governance systems that works, because it's at the core of cities. So if we fail to learn crucial lessons, as we mentioned about the importance of data information, so encouraging coordination between different levels of government and different public services, and also including the voices of marginalized groups like children, minorities. So if we don't take stock and we don't learn from this, we risk, as it was just said, that we are laying the foundation for a similar and more possible greater challenge in the future. And when the risk of emergencies, like for instance, climate risk, is so pressing.
Okay. Thank you very much. No, thank you for highlighting again, some of the basic elements that you consider critical, in fact, for a more livable, urban environment, and for a better post-pandemic recovery. So thank you very much. And Robert, so over to you. And you, as you were arguing, right, there was so many issues that we need to deal with together. But the challenges are, I'm sorry, Maleka, before I move to, yeah. So Maleka, so what in your view, so what are the top actions? Okay, you highlighted how far we're behind in terms of the housing goal, for example. So what do we do?
So the first thing I'd say is bookending what I said at the start, which is for cities to put housing at the center. And that might seem like a really bold injunction, but these are not my words. These are the words of UN Habitat, that has a framework for cities to really ground their urbanization plans and development in housing, or at minimum not to have housing be peripheral. And one might ask, well, in every, thriving city you go to, there is all this construction going on. It doesn't seem as though housing is marginalized, but there is an issue of unequal access here, which is very much what we need to center in on with the COVID recovery and this decade of action, is not just making sure that formal housing markets are well supplied, but that adequate housing is available to all. So if cities are serious about that, then they quickly come up against this problem of the housing sector being quite complex and housing policy being notoriously difficult to design because it requires all this coordination across government departments and sectors, and maybe even more so than other sectors. And so what I would say too is for cities to adopt this mindset of doability, which I think we've heard quite a lot of throughout this panel, about using this moment in time almost as a renaissance and an influx of fresh ideas for reimagining urban centers. And there are lots of innovative examples in housing policy across cities. So some of the things that Robert alluded to at the start, so cities learning from each other and forming coalitions, that's the kind of thing that can really fast track innovations in housing policy. So all kinds of solutions from innovative land use, for example, community land trusts, which can really steward public lands for affordable housing development, to innovative housing finance vehicles that ensure that informal workers that wouldn't ordinarily have access to mortgage markets are able to get access through things like credit guarantees. All these solutions are out there. It's really about the eagerness and the proactiveness of cities to connect with these examples, to connect with peer cities and adopt them so that housing in this decade going forward isn't for just the better off. It really is for everybody. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Maleka. Your single point in my view is it's a question of prioritization at the end of the day, right? And we know that if a government, wants to address an issue that they prioritize, then you would take a multi-sectoral approach to deal with all associated issues, and that can help us move forward on this one prioritized issue. So I think definitely and you made a case earlier, how important the housing is, for achieving many other SDGs. So let's really work together to bring focus on this still huge challenge that we face. So thank you very much. And Robert, as I was saying, right? So you argued that we needed to deal with several major issues together. There's a kind of pandemics, diseases, climate change, and really inequalities and so forth. So the challenges are really significant, right? as much as there are optimism. As you mentioned, cities are taking actions themselves, municipalities are taking actions themselves, right? But after all, they are working within the national nation-state framework, and there are responsibilities and obligations do not always square with the kind of resources and decentralize the power they have. And so many challenges of governance, right? And for developing countries, the poverty level, the inequality level, and the multidimensional poverties are still quite severe. And so the government's prioritization, may not be on the issues that we want, to see addressed sooner. So your conclusion, concluding words, how do we?
Sure. I wasn't going to mention it, but you just raised it at the end there, which I think is that we're living in a world that is still designed in a way for almost 18th, 19th century institutions. And our demographics that you alluded to in the very beginning of this session suggests that we really need an upgrade, a recoding of our institutions, including at the United Nations, given that when nation states first came around in this, I mean, as the legend goes, in the 1600s and sort of emerged with the Westphalian state, less than 1% of the world lived in the city. And as you yourself have said, and as the UN has chronicled, we now have over 55% of the world living in cities. There's going to be a complete restructuring of the nature of our systems, and yet we're still operating in a state-centric model. And I think that's a big structural issue that we have to engage with, which is not easy, especially in international institutions like the United Nations. But there are a couple of big takeaways that I'm drawing from this panel, which I just wanted to kind of underline, which I think is number one, and all panelists had mentioned this, I think, is how the pandemic has exposed and in some cases exacerbated or accelerated the brutal inequalities and structural weaknesses that stratify all of our cities, wealthy and poor. The second, I think, big, takeaway is that this is an opportunity. And I think Malak and others mentioned at the end, it's an entry point for a redesign of resilient and digitally connected cities. And I think the third, and really we're getting to this at the end of the session, is that actually this is probably one of the biggest business opportunities in history. I mean, there are trillions of dollars in global capital markets looking for investment. And I think what I'm hearing over and over again from investors, be it pension funds or insurance companies or asset managers or others, is that we need to see pipelines of projects in cities. We need a good regulatory environment. We need to find ways of de-risking that investment, but that the opportunity is there. And I think we're going to see a rather large, significant investment in cities, especially the cities that have yet to be built, coming down the pipe. So I think in the short term, in terms of recovery, if cities want to rebound and recover, a lot of this is going to depend on the duration of the pandemic and how long it takes to roll out vaccinations. I mean, this is obvious. We've made some progress, but let's not forget that 50% of the 3.5 billion vaccines that have been delivered have gone to just 2 countries. There are still 95 countries that have yet to administer a single dose of vaccine. So this is a huge impediment, and I think we have to deal with that. In the medium term, the potential of cities to be resilient, as opposed to just rebounding, I think requires this reimagination that all the panelists have talked to. And I think there's 3 priorities that we need to focus on. I mean, you said 1, but it's impossible. I think we need 3 at least. In addition to all of the great ideas that have been mentioned, I think first, we have to focus on the most vulnerable. Second, we have to invest in digital inclusion. And third, I think it's all about climate mitigation and adaptation. I think in terms of the first, every city and neighborhood in the world, we've seen the same trend, which is the poorest elderly minority are not just the most at risk of disease, but also things like extreme heat, killer pollution, dangerous sea level rise, exclusion, discrimination. And I think this is a point that Smriti reminded us of, which is that the pandemic has been especially harmful on people in the informal economy, which, by the way, is 60% of the world's population. So we need a radical intolerance of this kind of inequality in our cities. And this means prioritizing everything our colleagues have been mentioning: compact cities, multi-mobility options, affordable housing, both for residential and work, innovative tenure arrangements, better delivery of services, targeting that last mile. So I think inequality reduction is number 1. Number 2, and this is the point that all the panelists mentioned, John, Sarah, and Ted in particular, reminded us of the pandemic has accelerated digitization, and the ways in which most large tech and banking consulting firms and small SMEs have moved in this sort of direction of this new normal. But this has generated new strains on cities, including on taxes and revenues. So as we've moved to more remote working, and as people have moved out of cities, the well-heeled in particular, this is a big problem. It's a big challenge. And these challenges are even more acute, I would argue, in lower and middle income cities. So I think the risks of COVID-19 intensifying the digital divide are real. And in very practical terms, as both Jonathan and Ted mentioned, we have to prioritize safe, universal broadband access, I mean, safe, as a human right, right? I think there's movement in that direction. I think we have to provide digital devices. There needs to be low cost internet. We have to think about digital literacy. We need to incubate those young entrepreneurs, as Ted mentioned, and we got to supply the training. And then finally, and I think most importantly, frankly, is climate adaptation and mitigation, which is absolutely critical for cities today, but also the many, many cities whose names we don't know yet. Virtually all cities are facing, and survey after survey shows this, significant threats of heat waves, water scarcity, flooding, and yet just 40% of cities, that's about 400 million people, don't have any kind of plan in place. And this is especially the case in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. So at a minimum, cities need to have a climate mitigation and adaptation plan and a pipeline of adaptation projects. And the good news is that cities that adopt a plan tend to be 6 times more likely to invest in climate-ready solutions. So just drawing on Malaika's final comments, I think we need to build using greener materials. That's key, given the massive carbon impacts, the GHG impacts of building. We have to get more efficient about our design. We have to retrofit and repurpose buildings. This is critical. And we got to build more densely and for affordability. And this means ramping up the green economy and incentivizing blended or public-private partnerships. And I guess the final point is we have to make sure our approaches are environmentally just, right? This can't be just top down and imposed. We can't have our green recovery discriminate and reinforce inequalities as they have in the past. The biggest challenge, I think, of all is we have to do all of this in the next decade. So I'm wishing all of us good luck. We've got a big task ahead.
No, thank you very much, Robert, for this really eloquent, again, articulation of the priority, actions. I agree with you. 1 is definitely not enough, and 3 is still a challenge. But we just have to focus and stay, focused on, on some of the priority issues you actually have highlighted. So thank you very much, Robert, and all panelists for this discussion. I will not attempt to summarize. And but just to say that even within the current nation-state system, I think we can still, make best use of the institutions that we have at this time, to link, nationally committed, international obligations, through, implementation at local, at city, and subnational level. Because for national governments to report progress on their international commitments, such as, for climate change, the NDCs, nationally determined, contributions, they still need, action at every other level to achieve these goals, and then they can report. And also, and I also agree with you on the question of investment. Let's mobilize the finance, because without finance, and the kind of problems we see will not be solved. And UNDP, we, for example, have now created, I think, 15 so-called investors maps, for 15 countries, looking at, sectors that are tied directly to SDGs, and then to show where, investment opportunities are and how big the market size are, and what the private sector needs to do is the due diligence to go to the next step to formulate the projects and so forth. I have an example, from one area of Turkey. I forgot the name of, but we have just for this one particular area of Turkey, the municipal wastewater and the waste treatment plan between now and 2023 will have $4 billion of investment with a return of 25 to 30%. We have done this kind of analysis for 15 countries. We're working this year for another 25 countries. So hopefully by the end of this year, we have a database of such investment opportunity maps for about 40 countries. So to bring financing, to leverage financing, private and public, to help dealing with some of the urban challenges. And so again, it's really, you already issued a call to action, and it's a big challenges, but we just have to work together to deal with this. So I again thank all participants, especially our panelists, for joining this session. So sorry we didn't have time for Q&A, but I see a very vibrant chat, conversation. So my colleagues will try to get this summarized and share this with you all. So let me thank you and maybe conclude our discussion today. And it's recorded and we'll make it available online as well. So thank you very much, everyone. Have
Thank
a
you.
good evening, good day,
Thank
good afternoon,
you.
wherever you are. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.